If you're listening to this, I beg you, don't ever try to find the place I'm about to tell you about, because if you do, you'll never sleep soundly again. In a rotting corner of West Virginia, down a dirt road that vanishes from GPS the moment your tires touch it, there's a pawn shop that's open every hour of every day, and it should never be open. I manage it. God help me, I still manage it, and I don't know how many more nights I can survive in that cursed building. They didn't tell me it would be like this when I took the job. They didn't say anything about the bloodstains that reappear on the ceiling, even after I bleach them. They didn't explain the screams that come from the vents, or the man in the suit who leaves no footprints, or the cold hand that sometimes grips my ankle when I sweep behind the counter. They didn't tell me that time doesn't move right in there, but they did leave me a list. 6 rules. 6 terrifying rules. They didn't explain them, they didn't warn me, they just told me, follow them if you want to live. I didn't understand at first, but now I know. And by the time you finish hearing what I've seen, you'll understand why breaking even one of those rules means vanishing into a place darker than death. Don't skip ahead, don't close your eyes. You need to hear this to the very end, because I need you to understand why I can't leave, why I won't survive much longer, why you should pray this place never finds you. I found the job posting late one night, scrolling through local classifieds after my last gig at a gas station ended in a robbery that almost got me killed. It was vague. Overnight manager needed, discreet, disciplined, desperate. It was the last word that grabbed me. I clicked. It gave an address with no business name, no phone number, just a note that said, "Ask for Mrs. Granger. Do not come during daylight." Stupid as it sounds, I went. My car stalled 3 times on the way there. The headlights dimmed even though the battery was new. When I finally pulled up to the shop, my phone died completely, even though it had been at 83%. The shop itself looked ancient, sagging with age, its brickwork cracked and blackened with soot, and yet the windows were perfectly clean, so clean in fact they didn't reflect anything. No trees, no me, nothing. A small open sign buzzed in the front window, that flickering like it was struggling to stay alive. I opened the door and walked into silence. Not the normal kind. Not the quiet you get after closing hours or on a slow shift. This silence pressed into your ears. It felt like something was breathing underneath it. The shop was cluttered with everything imaginable. TVs stacked on top of headless mannequins, old coffins leaning against typewriters, shelves of dusty porcelain dolls with eyes too lifelike. And then I heard her voice. "You must be here for the night job," said an old woman who stepped out from behind a curtain in the back. Her skin looked like candle wax. Her eyes were completely white. "You'll do," she whispered and handed me a ring of keys and a yellowed piece of paper. "This is all you need to survive," she said, placing it firmly in my hand. "Follow the rules. Follow every rule, or you'll end up like the last one." I opened the paper. It smelled like burned hair and metal. On it, in faded, spidery handwriting, were 6 rules. I remember them like they were carved into my bones. Rule 1. Never acknowledge the whispers. They come just after sundown. You won't hear them at first. They start like distant conversations, soft murmurs, almost like a radio left on in another room. But if you listen closely, they begin to speak your name. If you respond, if you even look around to find where they're coming from, they'll know you can hear them. And if they know you can hear them, they'll show themselves. I learned this on my second night. I was dusting the row of vintage rifles when I heard my name, Eli, Eli, echo through the air. It came from nowhere, yet it felt like it came from inside my ears. I turned. I whispered, "What?" Just once. I shouldn't have. The air turned thick, like syrup. The lights above me dimmed and everything went quiet. Too quiet. Then something scraped along the floor behind the counter. Something that sounded like fingernails. I didn't turn around. I just ran to the back room, locked the door, and waited until dawn. Since then, I've never answered them again. Rule 2. Do not touch the items in the locked cabinet. There's a display case near the register that's always locked with 3 heavy brass latches. Inside are 6 items: a tarnished pocket watch, a leather mask stitched shut over the mouth, a child's wind-up toy that never runs down, a rosary made of teeth, a wedding ring with dried blood caked under the diamond, and a photograph that changes every time you blink. I once saw a customer, young guy, maybe 20, lean over and fiddle with the lock. He forced it open, laughing, thinking it was some gimmick. The second he picked up the pocket watch, the glass shattered inward, slicing his hands open. He screamed, dropped it, and then just stood there, perfectly still, not blinking. He stood that way for 9 hours. When I finally blinked, he was gone. The watch was back in the case, ticking softly. Rule 3, always leave an offering at the threshold. Every night before I lock the door from inside, I place a small object on the mat outside. Coins, feathers, dried flowers, sometimes drops of blood from a nosebleed or scraped knuckle. Doesn't matter what, just has to be given. I skipped it once. Just once. I was tired, distracted. That night, the temperature inside dropped so low the glass cracked in the freezer. The security cameras caught it all, shapes writhing in the darkness near the entrance. Long, boneless figures sliding along the walls. That same night, something scratched from inside the safe. I didn't open it. I didn't sleep for 3 days. Rule 4. If the phone rings 3 times, do not answer. The landline behind the counter is older than the shop. Black rotary dial, not plugged into anything. On my 4th shift, it rang. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was piercing. Wrong. I couldn't help myself, I answered. A voice like broken glass and screaming children rasped, "Help me out, and I'll help you get out." I slammed it down. The phone hasn't rung since, but I know it will. And if I answer again, I think I'll disappear in pieces. Rule 5. Beware the man in the hat. He comes in sometimes just before the sky goes fully dark, always the same. Long coat, wide-brimmed hat. Face hidden in shadow, even when he stands under the lights. He never speaks, never touches anything, just walks the aisles. The first time I saw him, I said, "Can I help you find something, sir?" He stopped, looked at me. Just once. I felt something shift in my stomach, like a hand had reached into me. He turned and walked out, but ever since that night, I see him standing outside in the rain, watching. Never moves. Just waits. Rule 6. When the lights flicker, hide. They don't flicker from bad wiring. They flicker when it comes. I don't know what it is. I've only seen its shadow once. When the lights began to pulse and the air grew heavy, I ran to the crawl space under the register and slid inside. Through the slats, I saw something slithering, huge, wet, breathing like a dying animal. It dragged something behind it, a sack or a body. It paused at the register, sniffed. I held my breath for what felt like an hour. When it left, the shop smelled like rotting meat for 3 days. That stench, thick and rancid like a swollen corpse baking under a summer sun, clung to my skin and seeped into the fibers of my clothes no matter how many times I showered or changed. It was inescapable, like the memory of the thing that made it. A crawling mass of damp hatred, of hunger without eyes, of something that once might have had a shape but had long since shed anything resembling a body a sane mind could comprehend. That night, as I emerged from beneath the register and staggered upright on trembling legs, I made a decision I should have made weeks earlier. I decided I had to understand where these rules came from, because if I didn't, I wouldn't just go mad in that cursed pawn shop. I would become part of it, just like the others. The others? Yes, that was something I hadn't told you yet, but by now you've probably guessed it in the way people sense a storm building long before the first drop of rain. There were signs, always signs. The dusty old security monitor in the back that sometimes showed movement in empty aisles, a flicker of someone crawling on the ceiling or standing upside down in the corner of the screen with eyes like carved pits. And one night, shortly after the rotting meat creature came through, I saw her. She was maybe 16, maybe 17, hair matted and black with dried blood, crawling silently across the tile just beyond the safe. Her knees were twisted the wrong way, like someone had bent her backward, and her mouth was open in a scream I couldn't hear. I froze, didn't breathe. She didn't look at me, just crawled into the shadow behind the vending machine and didn't come out. When I went to check in daylight, there was nothing. No blood trail, no smear, just the hum of stale snacks and a flickering button for C5 that no longer worked. The rules, the cursed 6, became more than warnings to me. They became a map, a system of survival etched in my spine by terror and repetition. And I knew if I wanted to survive longer than the ones who came before me, I needed to understand why they worked at all. So I started looking for answers in the only place that ever seemed to give them: the back room, where the woman with the dead eyes, Mrs. Granger, had first given me the paper. I found it on a Wednesday, or at least what I think was a Wednesday, because inside the pawn shop, time bends like a dying man's breath, shallow and unreliable. A drawer in her old desk, locked with a rusted brass key I found inside the wall behind a shelf of cursed dolls, clicked open and revealed a pile of handwritten letters, each dated years apart, written in the same trembling hand that wrote the rules. They weren't addressed to anyone, just signed at the bottom with a single letter, G. I read every one, my hands trembling, my eyes burning with exhaustion and dread. The letters revealed fragments, not full explanations, like pieces of a puzzle half lost in fire. One described a man who broke Rule 1. He'd whispered back to the voices, and within 3 days, he was found hanging upside down from the ceiling, his skin peeled in long spirals, his mouth frozen in a grin so wide it cracked his jaw. Another letter talked about a preacher who took the rosary from the locked cabinet, swearing he could cleanse it. His church burned down that very night, the only thing left standing being the altar, where the rosary sat untouched by flame, now strung with something that looked suspiciously like his spine. It wasn't just the rules themselves that mattered, it was who enforced them. And in one of the final letters, I read a line that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. The rules are not meant to protect you from the shop. They are meant to protect you from what lives beneath it. That night, the lights flickered again, but this time I didn't run to hide. I had to know. I had to see more than just the tail end of whatever hunted beneath the tiles. I stayed in the open, my knees nearly buckling under my own fear, and stood by the register with nothing but the hum of a dead TV to keep me company. When the buzzing started, I felt it in my teeth first, like 1,000 wasps vibrating in my skull. The lights didn't just flicker, they shuddered, and then the air grew thick, like breathing through tar. It didn't crawl in this time. It oozed, seeping from between the cracks in the floor tiles like black, viscous sludge, dragging long strands of muscle and bone. It formed the shape of a man, but not quite. Its face was smooth, featureless, except for the mouth, an endless row of twitching teeth that clacked and clicked in unnatural rhythm. And then it spoke. Not out loud, not in words, but inside me. "I see you now," it said, though it wasn't a voice, more like a scream wrapped in silk echoing from the deepest pit of my stomach. "You broke the silence." I hadn't spoken. I hadn't acknowledged the whispers, but I had watched. And watching, I realized too late, was almost as dangerous as listening. I staggered back, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest, and slammed my hand on the emergency switch. An old breaker Mrs. Granger once said was for special nights. The lights snapped off. The thing vanished. But when the lights came back on a second later, something was different. The cabinet was open. The glass had melted, warped like plastic under a blowtorch, and the wind-up toy, the one that never stopped ticking, was on the floor, spinning, hissing. And standing across from me was the man in the hat. He wasn't walking the aisles this time. He was facing me. Still as stone, no face, no sound, just him and the hum of something ancient breathing behind him. "Why?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. He moved. Not like a man, not like anything natural. 1 second he was across the shop, and the next, he was behind the counter. He placed a single object in front of me, a torn page, yellowed and scorched at the edges, like it had been ripped from some long-lost ledger of nightmares. On it, a new rule was written in the same broken handwriting. "Do not break the rules more than once." And underneath, in what looked like blood, was a single word: warning. When I looked up again, the man was gone. I didn't sleep that day. I didn't eat. I sat in the back room, doors locked, trembling with realization, because now I understood something far worse than I ever imagined. The rules weren't ancient wisdom. They weren't made to protect customers. They weren't even about keeping the shop running. They were a pact, a deal, a cursed bargain between whoever built this shop and whatever lives beneath it. And now that I'd broken the silence, even for a second, the shop wasn't just watching me anymore. It was waiting. It was changing. And next time, it wouldn't just be a warning. The air in the pawn shop had grown heavier, denser, as if the very walls were imbued with a malevolent consciousness. pressing inwards with an oppressive weight that made every breath feel like inhaling thick smoke. And as I sat there, the torn page with its ominous warning still clutched in my trembling hands, I realized that the shop was no longer just a place of business. It had become a living entity, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to feed off my fear and uncertainty. The once familiar surroundings now appeared distorted, the shelves looming taller, the aisles stretching longer, and the shadows deepening into inky voids that threatened to swallow me whole. I knew then that I had to uncover the origins of these cursed rules, to delve into the shop's history and unearth the secrets that had bound it to this unholy pact, for only by understanding the nature of the beast could I hope to survive its wrath. Determined to find answers, I ventured into the basement, a place I had previously avoided due to an inexplicable dread that seemed to emanate from its depths. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing like a death knell, and as I descended, the temperature dropped precipitously, my breath forming visible puffs in the frigid air. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten relics and discarded memories, the detritus of countless lives pawned away and left to gather dust. Amidst the clutter, I discovered a weathered trunk, its surface marred by deep gouges and strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. With great effort, I pried it open, revealing a collection of aged documents, photographs, and a leather-bound journal that exuded an aura of palpable malevolence. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Granger, the original proprietor of the pawn shop, and as I flipped through its pages, I was confronted with accounts of unspeakable horrors and arcane rituals performed to bind the shop to a protective covenant. Elias detailed the 6 rules, not as guidelines for employees, but as sacred edicts designed to appease the ancient entity that dwelled beneath the shop, a being he referred to only as the Watcher. He described how the rules were established through blood sacrifices and dark incantations, each one serving as a barrier to contain the Watcher's influence and prevent it from crossing into our realm. However, Elias warned that the rules were not infallible, and any deviation or transgression would weaken the bindings, allowing the Watcher to extend its reach and corrupt the fabric of reality itself. As I absorbed this chilling revelation, a sudden noise jolted me from my thoughts. A faint whispering, barely audible, yet unmistakably emanating from the shadows that clung to the corners of the basement. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, forming a cacophony of voices that spoke in tongues both ancient and profane, their words seeping into my mind like a poison, eroding my sanity with each passing moment. I clamped my hands over my ears, desperate to block out the infernal chorus, but the voices persisted, echoing within my skull and threatening to shatter my psyche. In a moment of clarity, I remembered Rule 1, never acknowledge the whispers. Summoning every ounce of willpower, I focused on my breathing, grounding myself in the present, and refusing to engage with the malevolent entities that sought to ensnare me. Gradually, the whispers receded, fading into the background like a distant storm, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, allowing me to regain my composure. Realizing the peril I faced, I resolved to adhere strictly to the 6 rules, understanding that my survival depended on maintaining the delicate balance that kept the Watcher at bay. I meticulously reviewed each rule, committing them to memory and devising strategies to ensure their observance. I reinforced the locked cabinet, placing additional wards and protective sigils around it to deter any interference. I prepared daily offerings for the threshold, selecting items imbued with personal significance and emotional resonance to placate the entity's hunger. I disconnected the phone, removing its cord and burying it beneath a layer of salt and iron filings to prevent any unauthorized communication. I installed motion sensors and surveillance cameras to monitor the shop's interior, providing early warning of any anomalies or intrusions. And I kept a flashlight and a designated hiding spot readily accessible, ensuring I could react swiftly should the lights begin to flicker once more. Despite these precautions, the shop's malevolent influence continued to manifest in subtle yet disturbing ways. Customers reported unsettling experiences, items shifting positions when unobserved, cold spots that defied explanation, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Some spoke of dreams filled with grotesque imagery and whispered warnings, while others claimed to have seen fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edge of perception. I documented each incident meticulously, cross-referencing them with the journal's accounts and noting any patterns or correlations that might provide insight into the watcher's behavior. One evening, as I was closing the shop, a man entered, his appearance disheveled and his eyes wide with terror. He clutched a small, ornate box, its surface adorned with intricate carvings that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow. He approached the counter, his voice trembling as he recounted how the box had brought misfortune and death to all who possessed it, and he begged me to take it off his hands. Recognizing the danger, I refused, citing Rule 2. Do not touch the items in the locked cabinet. The man grew agitated, insisting that the box needed to be contained, but I stood firm, unwilling to risk breaching the protective measures I had established. Eventually, he relented, leaving the box on the counter and fleeing into the night. I carefully placed the box in a lead-lined container, sealing it with wax and inscribing it with protective runes before storing it in a secure location far from the shop. In the days that followed, the shop's atmosphere grew increasingly volatile, with unexplained phenomena occurring with alarming frequency. Objects levitated and shattered without cause, disembodied voices echoed through the aisles, and the temperature fluctuated wildly, creating pockets of intense heat and bone-chilling cold. I consulted the journal once more, seeking guidance on how to reinforce the bindings and restore equilibrium. Elias had mentioned a ritual, a complex ceremony involving the recitation of ancient incantations and the offering of a personal sacrifice to renew the covenant and strengthen the barriers that held the Watcher at bay. Desperate, I prepared the necessary components, gathering rare herbs, sacred relics, and a vial of my own blood to serve as the offering. As I performed the ritual, the shop trembled, the walls groaning as if under immense pressure, and a blinding light enveloped the space, searing my vision and filling my ears with a deafening roar. When the light subsided, the shop was eerily silent, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by an unsettling calm. I knew then that the ritual had succeeded, at least temporarily, in reinforcing the bindings and suppressing the Watcher's influence. However, I also understood that this reprieve was fleeting, and the entity's hunger would eventually resurface, demanding further sacrifices to maintain the fragile equilibrium. I resolved to continue my vigilance, adhering strictly to the 6 rules and remaining ever watchful for signs of the Watcher's return. For in this cursed pawnshop, survival was not guaranteed, and the price of failure was a fate far worse than death. Yet, even as I clung to the fragile hope that my meticulous adherence to the 6 rules would keep the Watcher at bay, a gnawing dread festered within me, whispering that the entity's insatiable hunger would not be quelled for long, and that the shop itself, steeped in malevolent intent, was merely biding its time before unleashing horrors anew. The days that followed were a harrowing descent into paranoia and unease, each moment stretching into an eternity as I scrutinized every flicker of the lights, every creak of the floorboards, and every shadow that dared to dance along the walls, fearing that any deviation from the prescribed rules would invite unspeakable consequences. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shop was bathed in the dim glow of the overhead lights, a sudden, sharp knock echoed through the front door, reverberating through the silence like a gunshot, causing my heart to lurch in my chest as I hesitated, recalling that no visitors were expected at this hour. Cautiously, I approached the door, peering through the peephole to find a young woman standing outside, her eyes wide with desperation and fear, clutching a small, tattered box to her chest as she glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if pursued by unseen forces. Against my better judgment, I opened the door slightly, enough to speak but not to invite her in, and asked, "Can I help you?" Her voice trembled as she replied, "Please, I need to leave this here. It's not safe with me anymore." She thrust the box toward me, her hands shaking, and without waiting for a response, turned and fled into the night, disappearing into the shadows before I could utter another word. I stared at the box, its surface marred by scratches and stains, and a sense of foreboding settled over me as I recalled Rule 2. Do not touch the items in the locked cabinet. Realizing the potential danger, I donned a pair of thick gloves before carefully picking up the box and placing it inside the locked cabinet, ensuring it was secured before stepping back, my mind racing with questions about the woman's identity and the contents of the box. That night, sleep eluded me as I lay in bed, the image of the box etched into my mind, and a growing sense of unease gnawed at my thoughts, whispering that the arrival of the mysterious item was no coincidence. The following morning, I woke to find the shop in disarray, items strewn across the floor, shelves overturned, and the air thick with the stench of decay, as if something had rampaged through the space during the night. Panic surged through me as I rushed to the locked cabinet, only to find the door ajar and the box missing. Its absence a chilling confirmation that the rules had been violated, though I had taken every precaution to prevent such an occurrence. As I stood there, grappling with the implications, the phone rang once, then twice, and on the third ring, I froze, remembering Rule 4. If the phone rings 3 times, do not answer. The ringing ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight, and I knew that the shop's malevolent forces were stirring once more, emboldened by the breach of the rules. Determined to uncover the truth, I reviewed the security footage from the previous night, my hands trembling as I watched the grainy images unfold. At precisely 3 a.m., the lights began to flicker, and a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct and shifting as it moved toward the locked cabinet with unnatural grace. The figure opened the cabinet without resistance, retrieving the box before turning to face the camera, revealing a face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, its features hidden in shadow, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I recognized the entity described in Rule 5. Beware the man in the hat. The footage ended abruptly, the screen dissolving into static, and I sat in stunned silence, the reality of the situation sinking in as I realized that the rules were not merely guidelines, but binding contracts with the entities that haunted the shop. In the days that followed, the atmosphere within the shop grew increasingly oppressive, the air thick with tension and the walls seeming to close in around me, as if the very structure was alive and aware of my every move. Customers began to report strange occurrences, whispers that seemed to emanate from nowhere, items moving of their own accord, and an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to them long after they left the premises. One evening, as I prepared to close the shop, the lights began to flicker, and I instinctively dove into the crawl space beneath the register, my heart pounding as I listened to the heavy, labored breathing of the entity as it moved through the shop, dragging something behind it. Through the slats, I caught a glimpse of the man in the hat, his form distorted and shifting as he paused near the register, his head tilting as if sensing my presence, and I held my breath, praying that he would move on. After what felt like an eternity, the entity departed, and I emerged from my hiding place, the shop once again reeking of decay and rot, a grim reminder of the consequences of breaking the rules. Desperate for answers, I delved into the shop's history, uncovering records of previous owners who had vanished without a trace, their disappearances coinciding with reports of similar phenomena, suggesting a pattern that spanned generations. It became clear that the shop was a nexus of malevolent energy, a conduit for entities that fed on fear and chaos, bound by the rules that served as both protection and prison. Realizing that mere adherence to the rules was no longer sufficient, I sought out Elias, the enigmatic figure who had first introduced me to the rituals that kept the entities at bay. He revealed that the rules were part of an ancient pact, a tenuous agreement between humanity and the entities, maintained through rituals and sacrifices that appeased their insatiable hunger. Elias warned that the balance was shifting, the entities growing restless and the rules losing their power, and that a final confrontation was inevitable. Armed with this knowledge, I prepared for the coming battle, reinforcing the shop's wards and gathering the necessary components for a ritual that would either banish the entities or consume me in the process. As the appointed hour approached, the shop trembled, the walls groaning as the entities stirred, and I stood at the center of the chaos, chanting the incantations and offering my own blood as a sacrifice, determined to end the cycle once and for all. The air grew thick with energy, the lights pulsing as the entities manifested, their forms writhing and shifting as they converged upon me, and I felt the weight of their presence pressing down on my soul. With a final, desperate cry, I completed the ritual, unleashing a surge of energy that engulfed the shop, the entities shrieking in rage as they were drawn into the void, their forms dissolving into nothingness. When the light subsided, the shop was silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious, knowing that the battle was won. But the war was far from over. For the rules remained, etched into the very fabric of the shop, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the veil, waiting for the next opportunity to break through. The calm that followed the ritual was deceiving, an eerie, unnerving silence that wrapped the shop in an almost tangible stillness, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, some unseen force to move again. I stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, my body bruised and exhausted from the ritual's toll, but the oppressive sense of dread that had haunted me for so long was finally, briefly, gone. The darkness had receded, but it wasn't finished with me yet. I knew this much, even before the first flicker of the lights pulled me back into the nightmare I had hoped would be over. The flickering was faint at first, barely noticeable, but then it began to pulse with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic intensity, like a heartbeat drumming through the shop. A cold, suffocating air filled the room, thick and damp, and for a moment I thought I could hear something distant, like the soft, wet drag of nails across concrete. I held my breath, instinctively scanning the shadows for movement, but the shop was as still as death. I stepped back, my hand reaching toward the crawlspace beneath the counter, the place that had been my refuge before, but I hesitated, knowing deep down that whatever was coming would not be fooled by hiding this time. Whatever had been bound by the ritual, whatever had been forced into the void, had not been vanquished. It had been merely delayed. Then the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. It wasn't an echo of the past this time. This was real, a sharp, clear sound that sliced through the stillness, reverberating in the pit of my stomach. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the phone, a dark premonition settling deep in my chest. Rule 4. If the phone rings 3 times, do not answer. I knew what I had to do. But the voice, the whispering voice that had been waiting, whispering to me in the back of my mind for days, told me something different. Answer it, or it will come for you. That was all it took. The words were so simple, so persuasive, as if the voice already knew what I was going to do, knew the price I was willing to pay to stop the chaos. The phone rang again, once more, louder now, echoing through the walls. I couldn't resist. I picked up the receiver with trembling hands. Hello? I breathed, my voice small, weak, almost begging for some sign that I wasn't entirely alone. The line crackled with static, but then a slow, rasping breath came through, followed by a voice I knew too well, one I had heard in every nightmare since the first time I had broken the rules. You're not alone anymore, are you? The voice was low, almost mocking, sending a chill down my spine. You broke the pact, and now it's time to pay the price. I dropped the phone as the words echoed in my mind, the phone continuing to ring and ring, even after the connection was lost. My hand shot out, grabbing the nearby counter for support, my body shaking uncontrollably as a deep, nauseating sense of wrongness filled the room. I had made a grave mistake. The shop was no longer just a pawn shop. It was a prison, and the entities that dwelled beneath it were far more than I had ever feared. The light flickered again, but this time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the kind of flicker that signified the usual ominous presence. This flicker was a signal. Something was here. Before I could react, the air grew cold. The doors of the shop creaked open. The shadow in the doorway stood still, an outline against the dim light from the outside street. There was a figure, but not just any figure. The man in the hat. He stood silently at the threshold, his presence enough to freeze the blood in my veins. His hat was low over his eyes, his features hidden in the darkness, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy, suffocating, as if he were peering into the very core of my soul. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shop seemed to warp around me, distorting reality, as if the space itself was folding in on itself. closing me in. The man took a slow step forward. A low growl reverberated through the floorboards as he moved, each step seeming to echo with a terrifying finality, a promise of the horror that was about to unfold. "You thought the ritual would save you," he said, his voice smooth like velvet laced with poison. "You thought that by offering yourself to the darkness you could control it, but the rules were never meant to be broken. Not by you, not by anyone." My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to speak, but no words came. The man's presence alone was enough to paralyze me with fear. "I told you to beware," he continued, his voice growing louder, more commanding. "I told you to be cautious, to follow the rules, but you couldn't resist, could you? You wanted to know the truth. You wanted to see the face of what lurks beneath." The man raised his hand, his fingers long and unnaturally thin, as if they were designed to coil around the very fabric of the world itself. The moment his fingers touched the air, everything changed. The shop shifted around me, the walls bending in impossible angles, the floors crumbling beneath my feet. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, muffled by the crushing pressure that seemed to bear down on me from all sides. And then, in the center of the shop, something began to emerge. It wasn't a shadow this time. It wasn't an apparition or a fleeting image. No, this was real, solid, tangible, and horrific. The figure that crawled from the very foundation of the pawn shop was grotesque, its form massive and pulsating, its skin dripping with an oily substance that glistened in the dim light. Its eyes were the size of dinner plates, black and endless, staring straight through me. The Watcher. It had returned, not just as a specter, not as a fleeting shadow, but as the true entity it was, its hunger overwhelming everything, its presence suffocating. The rules hadn't been enough. Nothing would ever be enough. And as the man in the hat stepped aside, revealing the full scope of the entity, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The pawn shop, the rules, the rituals, none of it was ever meant to save anyone. It was all just a game. A game for the Watcher to play with the living. And now the rules had been broken too many times. The cycle would never end. The Watcher's hunger was insatiable. It would always return, and now it was coming for me.